Hi, thanks so much for coming. Today I'd like to share with you my vision for improving the lives of students on the spectrum. Sometimes something happens to you that changes your future forever. And sometimes an event can change your past. I've experienced both. The first was 20 years ago when my son was 2.5. And the doctor looked at my wife and me and said, "Your son has autistic disorder." There's my son with a picture, with the word autism superimposed on his head. That perfect path that I'd envisioned for our future just vaporized in a flash, and we were instantly thrust into the world of autism, early intervention, applied behavioral analysis, and special education. The second event happened 4 years ago, when my wife and I were at a conference, an autism conference, listening to the keynote speaker, Sarah Hendricks, pictured here with rose-colored glasses. Sarah is an articulate, entertaining speaker who got a master's in autism studies, wrote several books on autism, helped clients, and then realized in her 40s that she herself is on the spectrum. Wait, a professional in the field who's on the spectrum? At that moment, my wife and I realized that someone else in our family was on the spectrum, me. If you're familiar with grief and trauma, you know that one of the first reactions is denial. So no surprise that, like Luke Skywalker, when Darth Vader tells him that he's Luke's father, I wanted to scream, "No!" After that initial reaction came other developments, such as going back through my past and having everything make sense for the first time. Why I was bullied as a child, why I didn't look anyone in the eye throughout childhood, why I had such specific fixations on particular topics, such as reptiles and astronomy, and there I am pictured as a youth with a reptile and a rocket. Why I'm such a picky eater, why I'm so hard to read, why I'm so sensitive to smells, and on and on and on. After that initial reaction came other developments, such as what author Philip Wiley describes as the 9 degrees of autism, or what psychologist Dr. Jennifer Gibson calls the stages of disability identity development: passive awareness, realization, and acceptance. Over time, I became comfortable with who I am, an adult on the spectrum, and I dove deeper into the autism field, co-writing a book on older adults on the spectrum and helping spectrum teens transition to college. And there's a photo of the cover of the book with birds on it and a photo of a college. I learned that while autism is often viewed as a disorder or a disability, it can also be seen as a difference that sometimes brings helpful skills and fresh perspectives. When my colleagues and I surveyed 150 adults on the spectrum, over 50 around the world, we found that while challenges remained, life got better after diagnosis. The most common reaction to diagnosis was relief, often followed by other changes such as increased self-acceptance and engaging with the autism community. As one 61-year-old English woman said, "I'm allowed to realize I'm a human being. My God, everything fell into place. I wouldn't be anyone else for anything. I only wish I'd known it younger." And there's the findings with a photo of an older man. But the situation for young adults is troubling. A recent study of 3,000 college students found that 6% of them had had suicidal thoughts in the past year. But a study of autistic college students found that over half of them had had suicidal thoughts in the past year. And there are the statistics with the photo of an unhappy younger man. So why are young adults on the spectrum so distressed? Well, for one thing, many of them have been bullied, which can lead to PTSD. Many of them struggle with social interactions and sometimes with academics. Only about a third go on to college, which is a lower rate, significantly lower rate than other groups, such as those with learning disabilities, most of whom go to college, and there's a photo of a college. When I tour colleges, there's often a mention of diversity. Geographic diversity, racial diversity. I've yet to hear a college boast about neurodiversity, sexual orientation diversity, or disability diversity. If we want true inclusion, we need to have diverse faces, bodies, and photos, diverse faces, bodies, and abilities across the board. Now, one of the ways that many people on the spectrum cope with rejection or fear of discrimination is by camouflaging or trying to hide their autism. Trying to pass as neurotypical. Trying to pass as a member of the majority culture is something that many minorities have struggled with for a long time. As one 18-year-old female said, it's easier, I don't think I'll ever completely take the mask off. It's easier having people you're friendly with than taking the mask off and revealing the real broken you. So clearly there's problems with camouflaging, in particular effects being anxiety, depression, and fatigue. And here's a photo of a sad younger woman. So one of the first steps is to take the mask off and be yourself. I am autistic. There's a photo of me with the word autism superimposed on it. I may be different from you, but who knows? If you get to know me, you might like me. But being yourself can be scary and risky. What if people don't like me? But you know what? If people like you when you're wearing a mask, they don't really like you, they only like the phony version of you. Embracing your true self is the only way to be truly accepted by others. And if you're more comfortable in your own skin, you'll be more likely to accept appropriate supports and services. So, as I was saying before, if we want true inclusion, we need to see diverse faces, bodies, and abilities in the promotional brochures and the photos on the campus walls, in student panels, in student tour guides. We need autism clubs, adaptive versions of freshman orientation, and sensory-friendly move-in days. And there's a couple of photos of, in college, a library and a blackboard. On the Top College Consultants website, I've created a list of autism-friendly colleges and universities. Some of them do have autism clubs. Some have non-degree certificate programs for students with intellectual disabilities, and others have comprehensive autism support programs. When students access these programs, their retention and graduation rates are often higher than their neurotypical peers at the same college. But sadly, after years of feeling ashamed of being different, after leaving special education behind in high school, students are often reluctant to access the very programs that might help ensure their success. There's another issue with these programs, and that is that while many of them charge no additional fees, some of them cost thousands of dollars on top of tuition, which I understand because you've got significant staffing costs. I only hope that colleges can find a way to fund these programs so that the financial burden doesn't fall entirely on the students needing the services. I mean, students with celiac disease don't have to pay extra for gluten-free meals in the dining hall. In addition, my list represents less than 5% of all higher ed institutions. I look forward to the day when we no longer need an autism-friendly college list because all campuses will be welcoming, thriving, neurodiverse communities. Author Steve Silberman, who wrote Neurotribes, says that people like Greta Thunberg, pictured here with a microphone, people like Greta Thunberg have valuable insights, not in spite of their autism, but because of it. Great minds, in other words, don't always think alike. Greta's commitment to fighting climate change led her to go on strike in front of the Swedish parliament at age 15. And 6 months later, over 1 million young people in 100 countries did the same. Greta says that for those of us who are on the spectrum, almost everything is black and white. There are no gray areas when it comes to survival. Either we go on as a civilization or we don't. We have to change. She has since been nominated for a Nobel Prize. How many other Gretas are out there right now, waiting to be nurtured, encouraged, and discovered? There are 50,000 students on the spectrum graduating high school in the US every year. Let's help them treasure what makes them different, because it's not too late to change their future. Thank you. Oh, okay. I guess I have a couple minutes for questions. I also have references up there, if anyone's interested in where the statistics came from. Yes?
How would you recommend an instructor go about supporting students?
We're gonna bring the mic.
Thank you for the talk, and I'm just curious because you mentioned the importance and the value that came from being diagnosed, how you would recommend in the college environment supporting students in receiving that diagnosis, either from the faculty or from the disability service, however that may come up.
Supporting students in receiving the diagnosis?
Yes.
To get the diagnosis or after they've been diagnosed?
To receive the diagnosis that they may not know that they fall under the spectrum.
So you think of a situation where a faculty member or staff person might think that the person is on the spectrum and...
I don't know what that would look like exactly, but just if there's a student that may fall into the spectrum but just hasn't been diagnosed, what would it look like to support them in receiving that? I know just going to them would not be a great idea and just assuming.
I mean, as far as the technical aspects of it, it's typically done with a neuropsychological evaluation, and although some colleges can do that on campus, usually people are referred out in the community. It's a tricky conversation to have with someone because it's usually before being diagnosed, people aren't necessarily open to it. But if they're struggling, if they're having some difficulty academically, socially, organizationally, then you might suggest an evaluation to figure out what's going on, because an evaluation isn't just for a diagnosis, it's also for recommendations. And a professional might be able to help figure out what the issues are very specifically and make recommendations. So it wouldn't be, I think you need to go to someone to see if you're autistic, because that in itself is just one piece of information, but to get a full diagnosis, a full evaluation with some recommendations.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Other questions besides how to turn the heat down? Yes.
So I guess piggybacking on that, whether you know somebody has a particular disability or not, we're talking about somebody on the spectrum, but what are things maybe from your reflective perspective would have been helpful for faculty to do to be more helpful in making things available and accessible and better? Mm-hmm.
Well, I think in general, trying to work towards understanding and compassion rather than sort of judging and criticizing. If a student is struggling with something, to help them figure out where they can access supports, where they can talk to someone, whether it's a counseling center, disability center, academic support center, rather than just sort of deliver a message like you're not cutting it in this class, or it's a problem that you're not turning your homework in, or that you're not participating in discussions. Not just sort of deliver the bad news, but give them some avenue to address it. Yes?
What are some of the most innovative practices or cultural adjustments that you've seen on college campuses to promote inclusion? I'm thinking I hadn't even really considered the sensory reduced move-in day as a possible solution or a possible environmental sort of barrier. And so I'm wondering what other areas in the college environment maybe you've seen some really progressive change, some innovation design kind of things.
Well, I feel like we're still early on in the arc of making these kinds of adaptations, maybe not as far as along as with other disabilities. I was just talking to person at a university that does a lot of support for students with learning differences, and he said that they made a decision to put the support center sort of smack in the middle of campus, like in a very obvious place, rather than having students feel like they have to kind of sneak off and get help, that it's normalized. And colleges like that one, and I know of another one where 25% of the students are using the service, not just students with diagnoses, but students who could use tutoring or other kinds of support. That helps normalize it. So, making it part of the normal culture instead of like, well, if you have this problem, you can go over here and get help, but everyone else is just fine. So I think that's a nice message to send, that anyone can use this. You don't necessarily have a diagnosis to get academic support, and lots of students use it. So I think sending that message, and the kinds of things I said, having diverse pictures, and I think in designing a program, it's really important to include the kind of people who are going to use the program, to not assume that you know what's best for them. There's a well-known autistic advocacy organization, and their slogan is "Nothing about us without us." So, you have to include us if you want to know what's going to be helpful to us. There was a recent article on there's an issue with the terms high functioning and low functioning. A lot of people on the spectrum don't like those terms, and so people wonder, well, what do we call you instead? And one professor quoted in the article said, "Call people what they want to be called." So.
Okay, Eric, we have one last question for you.
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to reply to the last question. So at Florida State, we don't specifically do things, but I think what we're starting to see is Disability Resources Office taking a much more proactive approach to really that transition period, and making sure that especially, all of our students, but especially students on the spectrum, have the supports that they need during that initial transition. And that can look a variety of ways. We just got a request for a sensory reduced move-in. And so, making sure that you have those close partnerships with housing so that it's not cumbersome to ask them. For instance, we have our marching band students that move in early. So the argument that I always make is, if our marching band students are in our residence halls, why can't we do something for a sensory reduced move-in that's 2 days before move-in for everyone else? We offer a first-year seminar just for students with disabilities that's focused on their transition period. And it's it's a 1 hour class that meets once a week. And, it's not heavy in terms of papers and things of that nature, but it's a real time to start processing through some of those difficulties that they're facing their first year and try to normalize those, and but then also build that community, so that we're not forcing students into this paradigm on our campuses that, well, you have to do things this way, and we can help them find their little niche on campus that makes them feel welcome and makes them feel like they belong on campus. So.
All right, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. That was very informative.